So your authority marketing has done its job and someone has raised their hand and wants to learn more about your business and whether or not you can help. Congratulations, that's a huge first step. But this is where a lot of companies screw it up. Too many consultants think that they can just waltz into a prospective client call and wing it. And while it is theoretically possible to get by on sheer intellect and charisma, in an ideal world, you don't want to leave these conversations to chance. The perfect intro call is a lightly scripted process that you use every single time to make sure that you leave a good first impression. When your service offerings are relatively low cost, it can almost always immediately lead to a proposal. And in the context of a larger engagement or a more drawn-out sales cycle, it usually will lead to at least a concrete next step. In this video, we're going to walk through how to create that intro call and how to execute it successfully. One note before we get into it, this implies that you've identified who your ideal client is. If you have not done that, stop, do not press go, do not collect $200. This process is heavily rooted in the pain points of your client and your understanding of those pain points. And if you have not identified your ideal client, it is highly unlikely that you will do that successfully. So if you don't have a very clear definition of your ideal client, I would recommend that you go check out our article and video on how to do that, which we will link to in the comments. So the key idea behind this process is that trusted advisors don't pitch. And it took me a really long time to learn this lesson. And what that looked like for me was going into hour-long sales call or hour-long intro call and me spending 55 minutes of that conversation talking. And we'd come in and we'd have this very beautiful 40-slide deck that was talking all about us and how great we were. And it took me a long time to realize that our clients don't, or our prospective clients rather, don't care about us. They care about themselves. They're sitting down with you because they already at least have a cursory understanding of what you do. And they believe that you might be a good fit for them. And to the degree that you are spending the entire time talking about yourself, that's time that's wasted, right? You don't want to be creating a me-focused pitch. And so trusted advisors don't do that. Trusted advisors don't pitch. Your job is to engage in a mutual exploration of fit with the client. You're helping them figure out what the solution is to their problem, even if the solution doesn't involve you. And you're also assessing whether or not they're a good fit for you and your services as well. Right? And so it's a little bit more, not standoffish, but it's more confident in a way because you're not signaling desperation. You're not signaling that you need them. You are consulting. Even though you are in the sales process, you are acting as an advisor that is trying to just help them accomplish the best decision for them and hopefully previewing what it would be like to work with you as a client if they decide that's ultimately the right decision for them and their business. So step one is making sure that you outline an agenda. This is good meeting hygiene in general. You want to make sure that you start the meeting by proposing an agenda and a purpose for the meeting. So that might look something like this. My goal here today is to learn a little bit about each other, figure out what your goals are for your business, learn if there's maybe an opportunity for us to do something together. I've already had an opportunity to go through your website, so I think I have at least a cursory understanding of what you do. But I'd love just to hear it in your own words, a little bit more about your company, what it is you're trying to accomplish. I'll talk a little bit at the tail end about how we see the world. And then if we think that there are potentially next steps together, we can explore that. And if not, no worries. Does that sound like a good agenda for you? Is there anything else you want to make sure that we cover during our time together? So usually they're going to agree to that agenda as outlined, but you do want to give them a little bit of space to be able to chime in and to update that if necessary. It's like dancing in a way. Like you want to simultaneously demonstrate that you have control of the situation while also planting the seeds that you're mutually co-creating a solution together. So you want to make them feel like they have ownership in this process because then they're going to feel like they have ownership in the solution that you ultimately end up presenting. The bulk of the meeting is going to be focused on what we call the problem. The main goal is for you to understand what their problems are. You want them talking about their business, not yours. You want them talking about the issues that they're dealing with, and specifically want to draw out what the implications are of those issues. And in sales, they call this the idea of agitating the pain. You want them to really be thinking about and contemplating the problems that they're facing and realizing that the cost of kind of staying here is worse than the cost of kind of making a decision to change. Quantitative impacts can certainly be powerful, right? Knowing the problem costs them X amount of money or X amount of time can be helpful, but qualitative is helpful too, right? The emotional costs, the psychological costs, the costs of the team burden, the fear that they have about losing their team or team members because of this problem, that all is valid as well. During that process, you want to be peppering in thoughtful questions, follow-up questions. You can start with just like what else or what happens because of that, but you can also ask deeper questions. And one of the things that I have found is that The kinds of questions you ask demonstrate competence. So a lot of people think that the way that to demonstrate competence is by talking about how great they are. And I've actually found that by asking the right kinds of questions, that can actually signal that you have an understanding of their industry. Just by virtue of the words that you use, the terminology that you use, you can signal that you actually have an understanding of their industry and of their problem space through the kinds of questions that you ask. The other thing that you want to do as you're going through this is restate their problem back to them. That signals that you're actively listening. It makes sure that you understand the problem before you launch into your solution, right? Because sometimes you might have thought that you heard them accurately, and then it turns out that you didn't. So that can be really helpful as well. The other thing that I like to do is ask objection kinds of questions. And so these are questions that anticipate objections before you get into the solution. And by asking them at the beginning, you actually get the client to overcome the objection on your behalf. And so a good example of this would be, it seems like you've been able to get by just fine without trying to solve this up until now. Like, what's driving the urgency for doing this today versus waiting a year or two? And asking something like this reminds them of why the issue is urgent and needs to be solved. And actually, they end up addressing that objection for you through that process. Other kinds of questions you can ask: when did you first notice this issue? What would happen to the company if things kept going the way that they were? How does this problem rank relative to maybe some of the other problems in your organization? Who in the company is most impacted by this? What would a successful implementation look like? Are there specific KPIs or specific metrics that you use to assess whether or not you succeeded or failed on this? You can also ask personal career questions, like, what would this mean to you personally? How would this impact your personal career? What opportunities would this unlock inside of your company? One last note on this as you're going through this: I'm a big fan of taking paper notes as you go through this. When you are typing, definitely over Zoom, which most of our calls are these days, but also when you're in person, you might be taking notes on the call, but they don't know that. You could be taking notes on anything. And I found that by taking paper notes, it signals that I'm actively listening. So even if I plan on transferring my paper notes into my CRM after the fact, I think the act of taking those notes is a respectful way of showing that I'm paying attention and that they have my undivided attention, but also is better than not taking any notes at all, because I think when you don't take any notes at all, that signals that you might not be that organized. So you spend the bulk of the time talking about their problem, maybe 2/3. Then at some point you have to start to say something, right? And I think this is where a lot of folks can mess up though, because if you jump right into the solution, there might be a mismatch in terms of expectations. And so what I like to do first is talk a bit about what I call your point of view. If you've read any of our other articles or heard me talk elsewhere, I talk about this a lot. But basically, your point of view is your primary tool for differentiation. So if most professional service firms were honest with themselves, they would realize that they're not all that differentiated. They sell the same services as other firms. Your point of view is the way in which you stand out. And it's a combination of who you serve. It's a combination of like how you speak and how you show up in the world. It's your values, like why your company exists. And a big part of it is your like what you believe to be true about the world or about the domain in which your company operates or the services in which you are offering. And what that means is that ideally, if you've gotten real clear on who you're trying to serve and you're sitting in front of this person, the problems that they're going to be talking about with you are problems that you've already solved before and your point of view speaks to. And this is really powerful because what happens is it signals to them that you've seen their movie before. And it's really powerful because, especially like if you have your point of view written down on slides and if it maps to some of the problems that they've talked about, it creates a lot of reassurance because they're like, oh, this person understands me. This person understands my space. You've differentiated your company, not by the services that you offer, but through your understanding of their world and your understanding of their space. And your solution will end up being downstream of your point of view, right? We offer these services because of the point of view that we have. And the really neat thing about this, or the really powerful thing about this, is that if they buy into your point of view about the world, and if you describe, your point of view describes why they're facing the problems that they're facing, if they buy into that, then they are ideally primed to buy into your solution and you suddenly become a category of one. And so you don't want to move on to the solution until you get them to align on your perspective and your worldview. Because if they don't align with your point of view, they're probably not going to want to buy your solution either. So now you can talk about your solution, right? And at this point, it should sound obvious to them because you've gone through a logical progression. You've talked about their problems and why they're happening. You explained why those problems were happening and tied that to a larger kind of meta narrative or point of view that makes sense to the client. and then your solution is directly downstream of that. So it clearly makes sense, right? You're at the 10-yard line. Just a couple of tips on this. Focus on the benefits, not the features. You've heard this before in sales in general, but you're focusing on trying to solve the pain that they're currently experiencing, right? And you might want to tailor that to the client. In other words, like if there are 4 or 5 different pain points that you know that clients like theirs might have or that your solution solves for, don't talk about the ones that aren't relevant. Don't talk about the ones that they haven't addressed, right? Focus on the ones that you know that your problem will solve for. Relevance is much more important than being comprehensive. Also, you can stay relatively high level at this stage. It's an intro call, right? You want to focus on outcomes, not process, right? There's a sense in which process can be reassuring to people, but I don't think at this stage they necessarily care. They just care a lot more about what you're selling the vacation, right? Not the process of getting to the vacation. And I also don't think you need to worry a ton about tons and tons of data here. I think anecdotes are much better. Stories are much better, especially if the client for whom you're telling this story very closely matches the profile of the client that you're talking to, which again is another point for having a very tightly narrowed ideal client profile, which we've talked about before. Last point here, don't worry about the close, right? If you're selling something that has an even moderately high price point, I think it is very unlikely that you're going to close in this intro call. So don't try to. That playbook, I don't think, is hyper relevant for professional services. You don't need to create false urgency. You don't need to be super heavy-handed with things. All you need to do is try to secure a next step. And that depends on the nature of the work. In a lot of the work that we do, that's an engagement letter because our work is relatively moderately priced. So sometimes it might be an engagement letter or a proposal, but in a lot of cases, you might have a committee-based sale or you might have a longer-term sales cycle and you're meeting just with the internal champion. All you're trying to do is maybe create a business case document or something that they can circulate internally. You're consulting as part of the business development process. And so you want to create some type of commitment or some type of next step, but in a lot of cases, that is going to be creating some kind of deliverable that they're going to then use to sell you internally. And depending on the nature of the project and depending on the complexity of the sale, you might not even be involved in a material part of that. And so your job might be to just equip and enable that champion to be your advocate on the project and for their involvement. But what you don't want to do is leave with no natural steps. So you do want to make sure that at the end of this intro call that you have something identified as a next step so that you keep momentum going and something concrete. So that's it. A great intro call, just like everything else, is a trust building exercise. It's an opportunity for you to build a solid foundation with your champion or with your prospective client and set a really good groundwork for a successful client relationship. You don't have to have a sales hat and a client hat and have those be two different things. I think you can show up the exact same way, regardless of what stage of the buying process they're in. But by following a concrete process like this that is very focused on the client, focused on their problems, informed by your point of view, and then creates a natural progression to your solution, I think that you will create differentiation. You'll make them feel like you are in control, like you are competent, like you understand their world. And I think as a result, you'll be uniquely positioned to help them. And as a result, your success rate in terms of at least securing a next step will go way up.